Welcome, listeners. I'm your host, Gabriel Brooker. You may have heard that a foreign invader has never set foot on U.S. soil, at least after the War of 1812. Most people believe it to be a true statement. However, not many people know that this statement is false. For today's episode, I am going to reveal to you the only battle fought on U.S. soil. Prepare for the first episode of Beyond the Battlefield. It was a Sunday morning. As Japanese troops landed on the island, all 40 of the island's inhabitants were unaware of their presence. That was, before the shots were fired. As around 2,400 Japanese troops charged up the beaches, most of the residents were leaving their service at church that morning. The mud around them spattered from gunfire, and in a matter of moments, the invasion of the island was complete, with only one casualty. Charles Foster Jones, the island's only radio operator, was shot and killed during the Japanese attack. This island, Attu, was one of the 2 islands in the Aleutian island chain the Japanese invaded during World War II. Now this doesn't seem so significant, but it was devastating to American morale. That's because Attu, the island the Japanese now occupied, and the Aleutian island chain is part of the United States, in the state of Alaska. Attu was an easy target. Being only 35 miles long and 20 miles wide, a landing force could cover every inch of the island in a matter of weeks or even days. Having a population of only 40 residents also means no chance of resistance against a group of well-armed attackers. These 2 reasons made the invasion of Attu on June 7, 1942, very swift. Kiska, another Aleutian island about 200 miles away, also fell to the Japanese the day before on June 6th. Now, the strategic reason for these 2 occupations are still under debate, but most believe the Japanese invaded these islands to divert U.S. forces away from Midway, a U.S.-controlled atoll of islands directly in between Japan and the U.S. The Japanese invasion force, knowing U.S. forces would eventually arrive to retake the island, immediately got to work on building defenses. Knowing a battle was to come, the 40 residents of Attu were sent to the Japanese island of Hokkaido. Here, they were prisoners in a single building, guarded by a lone Japanese police officer. Little food was given to them, and several became ill. 21 Attuans died during imprisonment, and of the 5 babies born, only 1 made it out alive. However, the remaining Attuans were rescued at the end of the war, only to never be able to return to Attu again. The reasoning was because there were too few of them left. At first, American war planners believed the Japanese occupation of Attu and Kiska obsolete. They did have things more important to do, like holding off the Japanese fleet from moving further east in the Pacific. Later, however, the sudden opening of sea lanes after another battle in the Pacific created an opportunity for retaking Attu. Finally, on May 11th of 1943, the Battle for Attu began. Codenamed Operation Land Grab, an estimated number of 11,000 to 12,500 American infantry were deployed from boats on Massacre Bay to retake the island. Though originally thought to be a quick engagement, the Battle of Attu lasted for over 2 weeks. Remember, the Japanese had almost a year by now to build defenses and familiarize themselves with the island. The Japanese had moved further into the island as well, now taking defensive positions on the higher ground. American forces faced constant risk as they searched through foxholes littered around the island, and were sometimes surprised by pockets of Japanese forces. Engagements happened all over as the Americans had to inch their way inland. The muddy landscape proved difficult for not only the troops, but American artillery proved useless in the conditions. Constant rain and freezing temperatures proved fatal to American troops, who were not fit or equipped for such conditions. Frostbite, trench foot, and gangrene wreaked havoc upon the unlucky. Equipment failure was common, and the dense Aleutian fog prevented resupply planes from delivering their cargo. Misery was all the American troops felt. Improvisation introduced new methods of survival, from catching fish with grenades to eating dried thistle. Despite all of this, the Americans, aided by aerial and naval bombardment, slowly moved across the rugged terrain and eliminated Japanese defensive positions. Paul E. Carrigan was a participant in the Battle of Attu and later wrote in a manuscript, "Evacuation for either side was impossible or impractical. Options were reduced to one: annihilate or be annihilated. Can there be a more fertile ground for barbarism?" The Japanese were cornered. They had no escape in sight. American troops had taken the high ground. Supplies were running low, and the casualties were building up. The typical soldiers would give up and surrender at this point, but the Japanese army believed something different than most. They believed that surrender was dishonorable, and death should come first. This left one option on the table: a banzai charge. To listeners unfamiliar with this subject, a banzai charge was a final all-out attack the Japanese perform when all else seems lost. The goal? To survive the attack and destroy the enemy. The Japanese commanding officer believed one last attack to be the only viable option. Himself and the 800 Japanese soldiers that could fight would leave the next morning and assault U.S. positions on Attu. The 600 wounded were ordered to kill themselves. On May 29, 1943, one of the biggest banzai charges in the war took place as every Japanese soldier left charged U.S. artillery positions. Taken by surprise, the Americans were unprepared and were killed as the Japanese pushed forward. Combat posts were overran, and the Japanese successfully captured American artillery. Resorting to hand-to-hand combat, the Americans finally were able to overpower and surround the Japanese. The Battle of Attu was over. The aftermath: 2,351 Japanese deaths, an estimated 500 to 1,000 American deaths, and dozens of wounded Americans. After the battle, only 28 Japanese soldiers survived to be taken prisoner. The Battle of Attu is not widely known, despite the amazing story it has to offer. There are countless other stories from World War II just waiting to be discovered. An ocean is what history is. It has a beautiful, shimmering surface, but only by diving deeper will you find truly breathtaking sights. I'm your host, Gabriel Brooker. The script, graphics, and podcast are all created by me, with music provided by WWII Video, and additional sound effects from freesound.com. Information from the only World War II land battle fought in North America. An article by Nicholas Brouillard. Additional information from history.com. This episode could not have happened without the help of Captain Dale L. Brooker, a veteran and my grandpa, who compiled most of the information used in this episode. Join me next time on Beyond the Battlefield.